well that all this happened today because I thought I would escape the winter without cold and haven't. And I have a pretty bad throat and will go as long as I can, which may be pretty long. Nonetheless, until such time as I get out, and then we'll try to recoup a little bit. But it's not a good day all the way around. Talking then about the climax of the Chinese Revolution, specifically about those 4 years, those very historic 4 years between the end of the Second World War, between VJ Day, the end of the Japanese War in China, and that period in October of 1949 when the Popular Republic of China was installed. We're talking, if you please, about what the Chinese communist historians refer to as the third stage of the Chinese Civil War. That first stage being 1921 to 27, the second stage of the Civil War being 1927 to 37, the third stage, obviously, when the United Front during the war against Japan was broken in 1945 until such time, finally, as there was a communist victory. Or, let us put it more concretely, what we really are talking about is the conflict or the collision between American capitalism and Chinese communism. We are talking about that kind of confrontation between an American empire, or the desire for an American empire, and the imperatives of Chinese needs for development. We are talking about the bankruptcy, if you please, of a pseudo-nationalism, as it was expressed by the Kuomintang when it came face to face with the authenticity of a social revolution for which the roots were very deep. We're talking, if you please, about the incompetence of a ruling class in China, a traditional ruling class, when it came face to face with the mobilization of the Chinese masses. In essence, we are talking about something phenomenal and something historic. Because when we stop to think that there were 750 million people who then enrolled under the flag of communism in China, we are talking about the most monumental political event in our particular lifetimes, certainly from the quantitative point of view, in many ways from the qualitative point of view, and there was really nothing inevitable about that victory in the short run. And that's the point, it seems to me, that it is worth making. That essentially, even if we have dug very deeply, in order to try to find what are the long and deep historic causes of this Chinese Revolution, we are also perfectly aware that in the period of those years right after the Second World War, there was society after society in which there was a combination of forces, the strategy of American policymakers, combining inadvertently, sometimes without any forethought at all, with the self-interest of Soviet policymakers to contain revolutions and finally to snuff them out. That in society after society, there was this strange kind of coalition, this strange sort of bedfellow arrangement between American and Soviet policymakers, which meant that the revolutionary potential after the Second World War really was contained. And so we ask a question, and the question we ask is, why was that containment policy not successful in China in the years right after the Second World War? We ask the question whether there was something unique, something exceptional about the Chinese case. And of course, conceptually, we ask the question of whether the Chinese strategy, whether Maoism makes a general and permanent contribution to revolutionary theory in the period of our contemporary world. All of those things on our mind. And our starting point is the superiority, if you please, of Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang. When I talk about superiority, I mean a certain kind of physical superiority. We're talking about August of 1945, the end of the Second World War. And if you take the measure of manpower, or if you take the measure of military force, or if you take the measure of finances, or certainly the measure of diplomatic support, then Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang had established a government which they were going to remove from Chongqing to Nanking again, and after all had every opportunity, presumably, to rule on the mainland of China. That there seemed in 1945 no doubt on paper that the Chinese communists could not have contested and have won any kind of contest with the Kuomintang. That Chiang Kai-shek should have been able to stabilize the economy, to stabilize the society, and either to isolate the communists or if it came to war, if it came to civil war, to be able to crush them. Look, that you are dealing with the Kuomintang, which has an army of 3 million in 1945, as compared to an army of 900,000 that the Chinese communists had at the end of that struggle against the Japanese. You are dealing in the second place with an army of the Kuomintang that has the best American equipment, and which the United States has supplied in terms of military and economic resource. You are dealing in the third place with a Kuomintang that has money, that had accumulated by the end of the Second World War about $1 billion in dollar reserves or in gold, with which it could do something very important, with which it could begin to reconstruct the economy of China, with which, if it deployed that money correctly, it could even begin to make for some economic growth, for some economic development. You see what I'm saying? That the Kuomintang, if Chiang had been smart, could really and literally have boxed the communists in 1945, and in the short run, that communist victory would not have been a fact of 1949. And that is all underscored most dramatically by the diplomatic position of the Kuomintang, because within the matrix of international affairs, within the matrix of the attitude of both the United States and the Soviet Union, the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek were the government of China, and there was no other possibility or no other alternative. Now we can understand that with the Americans. American policymakers, let's give them all due credit. American policymakers throughout the Second World War had become increasingly contemptuous of the government of Chongqing, the government of Chiang Kai-shek, and the Kuomintang. They had looked at them as a bunch of gangsters, as extortionists, as a government, after all, constantly extorting money from the United States in order to line their own pockets. That was perfectly well known to most American observers in Chongqing. It certainly gets into the diplomatic record. And what the Americans wanted, and what would have been most desirable to them by 1945, was some kind of a middle way in China. In other words, it would have been more desirable if they could support a government that was democratic, that was more broadly based, that certainly wasn't as corrupt, that would be the client of American economic interest, to be sure, that would let the United States into that China market, but that would not be so volatile, would not be so insecure as the Kuomintang almost inevitably would be, given the kind of structure politically it had built up. But you see, between those two emotions, between an anxiety on the one hand about Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, and a passion on the other hand for the penetration of the China market, a passion to make of China, after all, the cornerstone of what the whole post-war American economic strategy is. Between those two emotions, there is no choice. Quite obviously, the economic passion is far greater. And if the only alternative to Chiang Kai-shek is not some third way but the communists, then you support him willy-nilly, and no matter how bad he happens to be. And so it was that on the 14th of August of 1945, in that famous General Order Number 1, which Truman was to issue at the end of the Japanese War, that it was provided that the surrender of the Japanese in China, their 2 million army men, their 2 million man army, and their puppet army, which was considerable in numbers, and all of the weaponry of that Japanese and puppet army should go to the Kuomintang. That it should be Chiang and his government that should take the surrender. That was the American position, and it was buttressed and supported by both Great Britain and the Soviet Union. But what is so telling is that it's not only the United States, but it is also the Soviet Union that really supports Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang and says there is no alternative. Know it well that the Russians didn't give a thing about the Chinese Revolution. They certainly didn't care about the activities or the actions of Mao in trying to lead to some revolutionary result. They thought at all points that the Chinese communists ought to collaborate with and subordinate themselves to the activities of Chiang and his Kuomintang. And that for two very obvious reasons. One, because the Russians wanted a China that was independent and friendly. And what the auspices of that China were really didn't matter. They wanted a friendly regime on their common frontier with Soviet Asia. They wanted a government with which they could bargain in order to get back certain bases that they had lost to the Chinese. That was item number one. And item number two was that they wanted a government in China that would not upset a possible détente with the West. Because we have underscored and seen over and again that Stalin had the idea that he might get a reconstruction loan from the West. And he had the idea that the West might recognize a world divided into spheres of influence if he did not upset that world. And a victory of the communists in China would upset any opportunity to get such an accommodation with the Western powers, and consequently Stalin muted any possibility for the Chinese communists and struck his alliance with the Kuomintang. And that was obvious to the American ambassador, Patrick Hurley, who went to Moscow in March and April of 1945 to find out how Stalin felt about a potential civil war between the Kuomintang and the communists. And Hurley wrote back to the State Department that the Russians really were very hostile to the Chinese communists, that there was Molotov jibing at them and making jokes about them. And there was Stalin saying that the only really integral political figure in China was Chiang Kai-shek. And consequently, Hurley writes back to the State Department. In short, Stalin agreed unqualifiedly with America's policy in China and said that he would support it. And so then Stalin saw Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's personal emissary, sometime later, this in May of 1945. It was Truman who now sent Hopkins over to see Stalin. And to Hopkins, Stalin again said that he would do all he could in order to restrain the Chinese communists, and the Russians took two very decisive moves. In the first place, they struck an alliance with the Kuomintang. It is the Sino-Soviet alliance of the 14th of August of 1945. And it is an alliance between Moscow and Chiang Kai-shek. And it says effectively three things. That the Chinese government will restore to the Russians certain bases in northern China that had been taken from Tsarist Russia after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 or 5, in return for which the Russians promised that they would mute any effort by the Chinese communists to try to take power. And in the second place, very important, that in Manchuria and in northern China, where the Russians had occupied in order to oust the Japanese at the end of the war, that in the areas the Russians had occupied, that they would give over those territories, not to the Chinese communists, who had established bases in Manchuria, but they would give those territories directly over to the armies of Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang. And the second thing that Moscow did was to call the Chinese communists to Moscow and to tell them what they were supposed to do. And Stalin reveals about that visit in his famous conversations with the Yugoslav Gilas. And in Gilas's excellent book, Conversations with Stalin, we find the following citation from Stalin talking to the Yugoslav about his conversations with the Chinese right after the Japanese War. When the war with Japan ended, we invited the Chinese comrades to reach an agreement as to how a modus vivendi with Chiang Kai-shek might be found. They agreed with us in word, but indeed, of course, they went away and did as they pleased. And consequently, this Stalin saying, yes, the Chinese understood our message, but they didn't observe it when they finally got back to China and really made this particular war well. What does all this mean? Well, you see, it's a great temptation for Chiang Kai-shek, and that was his undoing. Temptation goeth before the fall. And so with all of that military support and all of that diplomatic support, Chiang did exactly what he shouldn't have done if he were to survive. He had most of China in hand. If he had tried really to govern it, if he had tried to improve the economy, he certainly could have isolated and boxed in the communists. But he was anxious at that point, with all of that support, to launch a war. And the Civil War really comes from Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang. They're the ones really that manifest that desire, that launch into that. Now that began right after the war with Japan, when Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang decided to oust not only the Japanese from northern China, but also the Chinese communists who had established bases there. And they couldn't quite do that alone. They could do it only with American support. So that in the weeks after the war, the Kuomintang army did occupy the major cities of the north. It occupied Peking and Tianjin and Nanking and Shanghai. And that was easy. But then you see, to go further, to go into the extreme north of China, where the communists really did have bases, to go to Manchuria, to go to Jehol, to go to Johor, that required really a kind of railroad line, a kind of transport that the Kuomintang needed help for. And it's at that point that the United States, instead of restraining Chiang Kai-shek, supports him in this effort to oust the communists from their bases. Because on the 30th of September of 1945, the United States lands 53,000 Marines in China. And by the end of 1945, the United States had 115,000 Marines. And what those Marines did was to guard those very long railroad lines so that they couldn't be cut and sabotaged by the Chinese communists. And during that fall and early winter of 45-46, it was the United States that put its transport at the disposal of Chiang so that he could go up into these northern territories, airlifting and transporting by truck about 500,000 Kuomintang soldiers into Manchuria and into the other northern provinces to the west of that Manchurian base. And all of that, you see, is supported by the Russians. Because the Russians in Manchuria waited until February of 1946 to evacuate. And they waited until then because only then was the Kuomintang army there in order to take the surrender. That they did not give the surrender to the communists. That they gave the cities of Manchuria, which they had occupied, into the hands of the Kuomintang. And by the time you come to the end of February, Chiang Kai-shek really thinks that he has the communists on the run, and he is tempted into the largest design of civil war. Now the question is, did American policymakers ever get smart? Did they ever realize that this was a bottomless pit, that Chiang Kai-shek could never conquer all of China, that he could never really defeat the communists in a long, protracted struggle? Did they understand anything about that long social struggle? Well, there are historians who insist that the year 1946 was a year of great anxiety in the minds of American policymakers, that was the year of mediation, that was the year of the Marshall Mission, when General Marshall was sent to China in December of 45 and was there the better part of 46 to try to negotiate an agreement between the Kuomintang and the communists in order to negotiate a ceasefire and to end the fighting. And essentially, the idea behind that, say the historians, is that essentially American policymakers had a glimmer of what this whole Chinese Revolution was about. And yet it seems to me that the record does not speak that way, that the Marshall Mission, the whole idea of mediation in 46, was not predicated on any different goal of the United States than it had ever had, that it wanted a government in China that should be wholly receptive to the American economic position, but that it was frightened in 46 that somehow, if Chiang pursued this civil war, that his political base would disintegrate, that the economy would disintegrate, that the social fabric would tear apart. In other words, that he couldn't sustain a war. In fact, the Marshall Mission was doomed from the beginning. And it was doomed from the beginning because when Marshall went out to China in December of 45, he went out with the statement of Truman ringing in his ear. And it was a public statement that no matter what, the United States would send aid to Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang. And so it is the American commitment to that government which accompanies the Marshall Mission, and that means point two, that Chiang won't negotiate. He knows the Americans will support him. What concessions will he make to the communists? And number three, because the communists don't believe in these negotiations, and the only reason that they pursued them was to try to indicate to the Americans that they were better, that they were strong, that it would be money down a rat hole to try to support Chiang Kai-shek. In other words, to try to neutralize American policy, which was the greatest barrier that the communists would have to face in their road to victory. And so Marshall's mission, so he made a ceasefire on the 10th of January of 1946. And they all sat down together and they made the ceasefire. And then he got the Reds and the Kuomintang together and they had a political meeting. And they made a resolution with 5 points. It was all piety, about broadening the base of the government, about making a constitution, about bringing the communists into the government. But you see the point. The point is that Marshall went back to Washington in the middle of March of 1946, and he had no sooner done that than Chiang Kai-shek broke the ceasefire and began attacking communist bases in Manchuria and in North China to such a point that finally the communists struck back in force, which they did on the 15th of April of 1946, when they took the city of Harbin in Manchuria and several other cities. And then they said 3 days later, on the 18th of April, to the Kuomintang, they said, all right, we can hit back, but now let's really have a ceasefire, let's really have a truce. And Chiang wouldn't talk, because by that time, he had lots in the pocket. 600 million in Lend-Lease help between VJ Day and February of 46. And then when you get down, after all, to the other end, when you get to the 30th of August of 1946, it is the United States passing $1 billion worth of surplus military equipment in the Far East into the army of the Kuomintang. Why should Chiang negotiate? Or why should he stop? He runs on 2 fixed points, that he can conquer all of China, and that if he fails at any point, the Americans will come in volume. And they will pour not only the money in, but the men. So the question is, as the Kuomintang moves in 46, it's 1 year of victory. As it moves and won space after space and province after province, as it pushed the Chinese communists back, the question is, how did the communists survive? How did they win? What is Maoism in the last stage of this struggle? Here we come to something a little bit original. And it is, of course, a military strategy. It's a military strategy because it's a war. And at the heart of that military strategy is tactical retreat. It is Mao and the Chinese communists saying that they will not engage at that point in big frontal battles with the Kuomintang. They cannot fight for those cities out of which they are being ousted. They cannot make for pitched battles. What they do is retreat, and they disappear into the villages. They disappear into the countryside, and it is there that they try to build their infrastructure of support. And as they retreat, they do 2 very important things, and both of them are crucial. As they retreat, they force the Kuomintang to overextend its lines, to cut itself off from its supply bases, to diffuse its manpower, literally hundreds, even thousands of kilometers, after all, from those northern positions of the Kuomintang and those central Chinese bases of supply. And all of those, you see, fit into the second thing that they do, which is guerrilla warfare. That you mobilize the villages, you live interwoven with the villages, and you cut the rail ties, you break the supply lines. That guerrilla warfare is something that Chiang can't understand, that he can't cope with, that isolates his army all over China, and there is a corollary to that. And the corollary is that with strategic retreat, you fight and play for time. And time is on the side of the revolution. And you play for time. And you wait for the inflation to go. And So that was Mao's point, that the longer that Chiang Kai-shek went in this overextended war, the more that the economy in the country that he controlled would deteriorate, the more the social fabric would tear apart, the more his political base would decompose. And in that, Mao and the Chinese communists were right on the mark. It was a political perception of the first order. Because you see, that supply that had been coming into China, all of that Lend-Lease help, what was happening with that supply? It was not being used as the basis for an economic reconstruction of China. It was going into private black marketeering. It was going into the pockets of Chiang's family and of his friends. And it was useful for black marketeering fortunes, but it wasn't at all useful for stabilizing the economy. But you still have that war to run. And if you are not utilizing that supply in order to run the war, how do you pay for this war? You crank it out. And you have the most phenomenal inflation in Kuomintang, China, that you have anywhere over an extended period of time in the 20th century. What you do is decompose the economy completely. You do not use what the Americans are giving you in order to stabilize your economy. You use that for private fortune, and then you destroy the economy with this inflationary money. And that has four very important consequences. It means, in the first place, that that sector of Chinese society, which had traditionally supported the nationalism of the Kuomintang, I'm talking about the school teachers. I'm talking about the lower government bureaucrats, the ones who gave some rank and file support to the Kuomintang. They were desperate and they fell away. That for teachers and for lesser bureaucrats, they had a purchasing power in 1947, 10% of what they had had in the pre-war, and consequently the support for the Kuomintang certain to disintegrate. In the second place, you get widespread defeatism, the kind of defeatism which, as Mao knew, recruits for the communists and breaks down the walls of resistance to the communists. You get student strikes, you get hunger riots, you get defeatism from top to bottom. You get a corruption by people who aren't corrupt simply in order to live, and then two things that are crucial. You get the deterioration of Chiang's army. They can't live, they can't eat, and they begin to go over to the communists. That by the end of 1947, Mao Zedong indicated that there were 1 million Kuomintang soldiers who had gone over to the communists, either being captured or going over voluntarily, whole divisions moving over to the communists. And then finally, and underscore it, because this is the genius of that tactic of Maoism, that what that playing for time did, what that disintegration of the Kuomintang social and economic structure meant was that it discouraged American policymakers from going all out in China. They began to think that they couldn't do that. They couldn't do that for a variety of reasons. One, because the regime was so damnably corrupt that there was no way out of it. It was like a stable, see. So you get that from the American consul at Mukden in 1947 in July, talking about the way in which the Kuomintang comports itself in Manchuria. Nationalist military forces and civilian administration conduct themselves in Manchuria as conquerors, not as fellow countrymen, and have imposed a carpet-bound regime of unbridled exploitation on the area under their control. The result is that Truman sent General Wedemeyer to China in August of 1947, really to look over the scene. What could be done with this Chiang administration? Or what could be done to beef it up? How much aid? And would the aid help? And Wedemeyer went, and he was certainly anti-communist. But he writes in his Wedemeyer Reports, a book he published in 1958, that he was horrified by what he saw. And he told Chiang to his face that his regime was nepotistic and corrupt, and what he proposed to Truman and to Washington was that there be large-scale American aid, but that it be administered wholly by American advisors, and that the United States literally take over the government of China in order to guarantee its stability and also to guarantee its place within the American economic empire. Chiang wouldn't agree to that. There were no final reappraisal. The final reappraisal came by November of 1947. And there are high-level meetings of the Truman administration, of the Truman cabinet, and two facts become very important. One, that the United States cannot undermine its position in Europe, that it cannot spend so much in the Far East, that it will undermine its great and important objective of inserting European capitalism into the American schema. And secondly, that if China is a lost cause, if it is going to cost that much, the better thing in the Far East is to reappraise the possibility of Japan as an anchor of American policy in the Far East, a Japan which was the defeated power, but which could be built up, in which the Americans could invest, would become the great policeman against communism in the Far East. You see the point, that the Americans continue to send enough help to Chiang Kai-shek in the Kuomintang to keep it in the Civil War, but never nearly enough so that it even came close to winning. But all of that is negative, and all of that is defensive. And the other part of the Maui strategy is not negative and defensive, but positive and creative, because it is the factor of an offensive war, and that is guerrilla war. Now, guerrilla war, you know, and it's such an important part of the world in which you live. Guerrilla war is not just a chapter in the history of war. Guerrilla war is not just an aspect of war. It is a very specific projection of a kind of political movement. When we say guerrilla war, we mean the military part of a certain political revolution. We mean what Mao meant, after all, when he said, all right, the Americans in the Kuomintang, they want to find out about our guerrilla war. They want to make counterinsurgency schemes. They want to be able to win the hearts of our people. And so Mao says, the nationalists and their American advisors can study our technique of struggle all they want. We give them any text that they want, but they'll never be able to apply them successfully because they require the support of the people, and this they can never achieve. And that's the point of guerrilla war. That guerrilla war means that you live with and by and through the villages. It means that you live with a people that is both in your army and that understands what your army is doing. And you know, I tell you something parenthetical. It's really a pitiful thing when people who are so far from any conception of what organized people can do start to sit in rather verified offices and chart schema for counterinsurgency and how to win the hearts and the minds of the struggling peasantry and so forth. And in one of my curious journeys, something that I can hardly explain, as a matter of fact, I ended up in what in those days was being called the outpost of the free world, which was the island of Quemoy. And Quemoy is a rock in the Pescadores. It is right off the city of Amoy. And for a period of time, the United States was going to throw everything into the whole world scheme in order to defend this rock outside of Amoy. You know, Eisenhower went in January of 1955 and got from the Congress the so-called Formosa Doctrine, which meant that he could throw any military force into the support for Quemoy and Matsu, these two rocks that presumably the Chinese communists wanted. So I got to Taiwan, and I said to the Kuomintang there, people, and I said, well, I'm interested in the outpost of the free world, and you fly me to Quemoy. Well, they finally demurred. They finally said, okay. We picked a non-shell day, of course, because the Chinese communists shelled every other day. There was not a day when they weren't shelling. And consequently, went over there in a plane, literally designed, I'm sure, by Orville Wright. Never such a flight in all my life. Finally got to this island of Quemoy, Queasy, and got out, and because it was a non-shell day, and also because I happened to be the only VIP visiting that day, and which really shows you how completely benighted the rock had become by that time, and consequently I was greeted by the entire establishment. There were 21 Chinese generals on this particular rock, and we had this sort of fantastic luncheon underneath the rock with lots of booze, lots of this Chinese booze, which I can't take very well, and so by the time the lunch was over and I got out on top of the rock again, I really needed the air, and it was really tilted, and then this general said, and now you will do psychological work. I said, of course. But I said, what you have in mind. He said, we have this program, you see, to win over the enslaved masses on the Chinese mainland. And I said, all right, I'm happy to help in that endeavor. And I said, how do you do it from here, from this rock? And he said, the major has gone for the equipment. And the major came back and he had this handful of balloons. And the balloons had these long strings on, and then you tied things on the end of the balloons. You'll take some soap or combs or little big cans. You plug these balloons over to the mainland, and when you see the symbol of the civilization, what really the Chinese communists were missing, how they said slavery, when the Chinese got this, immediately upon grabbing one of these balloons, you immediately liberated the Chinese. That's a very useful bit of psychological warfare. I said, how many of these do you float over? They said, about 600. I did these calculations. I said, even if every one immediately were grabbed and liberated the Chinese, it would take you 17,000 years. And he said, it's really simple. He said, because you see, the wind currents are the other way. Anyway, what I was talking about is, if you're going to have Americans subsidizing things like that, and Kuomintang engaged in activity at that time, or if you're going to have university professors in Michigan State or wherever sitting around and deciding how you win the hearts of high peasants, then you're going to come up with socially at that time, and consequently what Mao says in that particular passage is positively right. Because you see what you get in that kind of guerrilla struggle. You get, first of all, what Jack Belden so very, very cogently in that marvelous book, China Shakes the World. What Jack Belden said that 8th Route Army was about. He said that 8th Route Army, after all, wasn't just an army. It was a school, it was a university, it was a theater, it was a political club, it was a festival, it was a way in which soldiers who had been in the fields and who had been peasants understood that they had weapons in their hands for some kind of revolutionary objective. And the same was true with the villagers. There's an old Shanxi proverb that is centuries and centuries old, which says that a poor man has no voice. And you see, this is the whole essence of what Bill Dixon has tried to do for you in Fanchon. It is the piercing of the dike that suddenly in the villages, when the army begins to organize its liberated zones, it pierces the dike. And people come out to the central square and they begin to talk. And they have these cahiers de doléances and they tell their grievances. And once they begin to do that, you can't stop them. And add to that something very important that you should never underestimate in regard to this Chinese communist victory. And that is that behind it all is the party. That the party, after all, would not permit spontaneity to get out of hand. And that is fantastically interesting in the liberated zones that are being really captured from the Kuomintang in 47, 48, and the beginning of 49. Which means that the agrarian policy, for example, becomes very, very much more radical than it had been in the Shenxi period. In the Shenxi period, it had been only lowering the rents or lowering interest rates. Now it becomes expropriation of land, redistribution of land, but with a limit, because the function of the party was not to make the elan of the peasants. That really they had already made. The function of the party was to catalyze this elan and to make sure that they didn't break down production and fundamentally that they didn't create counter-revolution behind the lines. You see, you have to understand. Now Mao and the communists never knew how quickly they were going to win this victory. By the end of 48, Mao still thinks it's going to take 3 more years. And he's amazed when everything breaks so quickly in 1949. So you want to keep productivity, you want to prevent, after all, any kind of internal counter-revolution, and consequently Mao says, in June of 1949 about this, he says, we must unite firmly with the middle peasants, and it is absolutely impermissible to encroach on their interests. You can take over the land of the landlords, you can take over the land of the rich peasants, but the middle peasants, those that have a little more than you must have collaboration. They comprise, after all, a fifth of the population. The same is true with the technicians, the experts, even the industrialists who are willing to collaborate. Mao's point is that if you are to make a road to socialism, you cannot break down the productive system all at once. It's very, very important to note that by the beginning of 1952, the Chinese communists already had gone beyond the industrial production levels of 1937 in China, and they did this by a collaborationist scheme that Mao defines this way: to counter imperialist oppression and to raise her backward economy. China must utilize all the factors of urban and rural capitalism that are beneficial and not harmful to the national economy and the people's livelihood. Whenever it is possible and beneficial, we must unite even with sectors of the national bourgeoisie. What you get then is a party very careful in the liberated zones to make capital out of the elan of the people, but not to let it get to such a point that the revolution then degenerates. So you see the point. You get the suicide of Chiang and the Kuomintang, that self-immolation, as it were. You get the peculiar lack of a solid commitment by the Americans, and yet a partial commitment that keeps the Civil War going. You get the guerrilla warfare of the communists, and you get that magnificent structure in the liberated zones of a controlled revolution which keeps both production and the elan of the revolution going. And then you understand what happened between September of 48 and October of 49. The big battle, the final push in the Civil War, between September of 48 and the end of January of 49. In September of 48, it is Lin Piao who leads the Chinese Communist victory in Manchuria. In November of 1948, it is Chiang risking everything on his Waterloo. It is the Way High campaign, November to January. It is north of the city of Nanking, on the plain, the central plain of China, a tremendous battle. In January of 49, the communists have surrounded that nationalist army and simply disarmed and dismantled 400,000 Kuomintang troops from that point on. It is the communists that have the superiority of numbers. They have the superiority of weapons. By the 23rd of January, they take Peking and Tianjin. April 21st, they pierce the Yangtze River and take the capital of Nanking. And then, of course, the government flees to Canton and then flees to Taiwan. And October, 38 years after, almost to the day, 38 years after the historic monarchy toppled in China, the Popular Republic is installed. 32 years, almost to the day, that Bolshevism triumphed in Russia, communism comes to China. A monumental event in the life of the Third World, in every life, because it is the peasantry over the landlords, it is development over inertia and misery, it is, if you please, the mobilized mass against imperialism, it is the party over spontaneity, and it is a functional and an operational Marxism over dogma. And that is so magnificent. And it is now on Marxism. We must assimilate Marxist theory and know how to apply it. We must assimilate it only to apply it. That what it is a method, it is a way of understanding, it is a mode of acting, it is not a dogma. And did we learn? And that's so crucial. And what of American policymakers? Well, you see, by the middle of 1949, it was a little bit difficult not to say that China wasn't long. And so Atchison, who was the Secretary of State in 1949, appoints a committee in July under the command of Philip Jessup, the Jessup Committee, which has George Kennan on it, to look into the question of what the loss of China means to the American strategy and how the United States should comport itself from that point on. But what is so interesting is that in his instructions to Jessup, Atchison already confined the work of that committee, because he said, "You will please take as your assumption that it is a fundamental decision of American policy that the United States does not intend to permit further extension of communist domination on the continent of Asia or in Southeast Asia." From that assumption, you see, flow two very important principles. One is the principle of the rimland. In other words, that if communist China has gone, that the rimland of Asia cannot go. And that means Southeast Asia, it means Korea, it means all of those territories where you may have to engage in action against these revolutions, against modernizing attempts and the like. And the second assumption that you must have a reason for that, and that reason is inscribed in the very long white paper on China, which the State Department publishes on the 15th of August of 1949, in which it says that the Chinese communists have managed to fare so well because they are a pawn of the Russians. Totally false, beyond question, a lie, and yet, of course, an operative assumption, because what enables you then to keep the rest of Asia non-communist is the idea that you are dealing with a global Russian threat. And all of that goes to Vietnam, and it goes to Korea, and it goes to that fantasy of the Formosa Doctrine of January of 1955, that you can throw anything into the fray in order to save Matsu and Quemoy. Oh yes, a Gallup poll taken at that time said that 97% of the people had never heard of Matsu and Quemoy, but the fate of the world was going to turn on whether those rocks remain free or not. Well, I tell you, friends, that we really live in a funny world, and that it is terribly important for us to go through life saying that the emperor has no clothes. It's better for us to go through life with no emperors. But if they're around, to say that they have no clothes. Otherwise, you're really going to go start raving mad. You read the China story in the 1950s is enough to drive you up the wall, because that whole story is based upon the "we lost China" theme, as though that revolution didn't have roots that were as ancient, after all, as the class struggle of China and the desire of those magnificent Chinese masses to get out of that imperialistic path.